The biting November wind whipped around the corner, rattling the thin glass of the bus shelter. Finn pulled the worn collar of his jacket tighter, tucking his daughter Rosie's small, gloved hand deeper into his pocket. Her warmth was a small anchor against the city's indifferent chill. He watched her breath fog in the air, a fleeting cloud of life. They had a ritual, a silent game of counting red cars to pass the time until the lumbering school bus arrived. Rosie was on 7, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was then that Finn noticed the other child. A little girl, no older than Rosie, stood alone at the far end of the shelter. Her pink coat was pristine, a stark contrast to Rosie's hand-me-down navy one, but her face was crumpled in misery. Silent tears tracked clean paths down her rosy cheeks, her tiny shoulders shaking with unheard sobs. There was no parent, no guardian in sight. A cold knot of parental dread tightened in Finn's stomach. He looked at Rosie, who had stopped counting cars and was now watching the girl with wide, concerned eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice muffled by her scarf. She said, he knew he couldn't just stand there. He approached the little girl slowly, kneeling to her level so he wouldn't seem like a looming threat. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you okay? Are you waiting for the bus?" The girl flinched, hugging a small, sequined backpack to her chest. She nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. I lost my mitten," she hiccuped, holding up one bare hand, red from the cold. "And Mommy had to go to a meeting. She said Nana would be here, but she's not." Finn's heart ached. He glanced around, but the street was empty save for the passing traffic. He gently unwound the gray, woolen scarf from his own neck. It wasn't much, but it was warm. "Here," he said, looping it loosely around her neck. "This will help." He then looked at Rosie, who understood immediately. She dug into her lunchbox and pulled out the oatmeal cookie they'd baked last night, the one she'd been saving. She held it out to the girl. "It has sprinkles," Rosie offered, a solemn gift of the highest value. The little girl's crying subsided into sniffles. She took the cookie with her gloved hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Just then, her bus pulled up to the curb. She looked at Finn, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the cookie and the borrowed scarf. She climbed the steps, and as the bus pulled away, she pressed her face to the window, watching them until they were out of sight. Finn stood up, the wind now cutting straight through his thin jacket, and took Rosie's hand again. He had no idea that this small, simple act of kindness had just sent a ripple through a world he couldn't even imagine. He was just a father, keeping his daughter warm, and for a moment, someone else's too. The fluorescent lights of the corporate lobby cafe hummed a monotonous tune, a sound that had become the backdrop to Finn's life. He moved with an economy of motion honed by years of practice, grinding beans, steaming milk, wiping down the perpetually sticky counter. He was a ghost in this grand glass tower, a functional part of the building's machinery that people looked through, not at. His manager, Garrett, a man whose ambition was as sharp and unpleasant as his cheap cologne, strolled past. "Pick up the pace, Finn," he snapped, not breaking stride. "The morning rush isn't going to serve itself." Finn just nodded, his jaw tight. Garrett enjoyed these small assertions of power, especially when Finn was at his most vulnerable. Today was one of those days. The rent was due Friday, and after paying for Rosie's field trip and a new pair of winter boots that didn't pinch her toes, the numbers weren't adding up. The exhaustion was a physical weight on his shoulders, pressing him down. He glanced at his reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine, tired eyes, a faint line of worry etched between his brows, the frayed cuffs of a shirt he'd mended twice. This wasn't the life he had envisioned. Before, there was laughter that filled their small apartment, the scent of his wife's painting supplies, the shared dream of opening their own little bookstore cafe. But grief was a thief that took more than just a person, it took the future, too. Now, it was just him and Rosie against the world, and his world had shrunk to the four corners of this coffee counter. He served a young woman in a sharp suit, her phone pressed to her ear as she barked orders about mergers and acquisitions. She didn't make eye contact, simply swiped her card and walked away, leaving her change in the tip jar. Finn swept the coins into the jar without looking. Every cent mattered, but the invisibility stung more than the poverty. He was just the coffee guy, the single dad people pitted with a sad smile before turning back to their own important lives. He thought of the little girl at the bus stop, her expensive coat and her profound loneliness. He hoped she was warm. He hoped someone had found her other mitten. It was a small, fleeting thought, a moment of human connection in a day that felt increasingly disconnected and overwhelming. Isabella Vance commanded the boardroom with an icy precision that left her executives both terrified and in awe. She dissected quarterly reports, her gaze sharp enough to find the single misplaced decimal point in a sea of figures. She was the CEO of Vance Industries, a titan of the tech world, and she had clawed her way to the top with relentless determination. But beneath the steel and glass exterior, a frantic, guilty heart was beating. Her phone vibrated on the polished mahogany table, a restricted number. Her nanny. She ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. Excusing herself with a clipped apology, she stepped into the hallway, the city skyline sprawling behind her through a floor-to-ceiling window. "What is it, Maria?" she asked, her voice tight with impatience. "I'm in a meeting." Maria's voice was flustered. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Vance, but it's about Amelia. There was a mix-up with my mother. She was supposed to meet her at the bus stop, but her car broke down." Amelia was alone for almost 10 minutes. Isabella's blood ran cold. 10 minutes. An eternity for a 7-year-old. Is she all right? Where is she now? She's fine, she's with me now. The school called me when she arrived. But she was very upset when she got on the bus. She said she lost her new mitten and a very kind man gave her his scarf. And his little girl gave her a cookie. Isabella leaned against the cool glass, her professional composure fracturing. A stranger. A strange man had approached her daughter. Her mind raced with every terrifying possibility. Yet, Amelia wasn't hurt. She was comforted. "A man," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me everything." Maria recounted the story as Amelia had told it, a quiet man with a kind voice, a little girl with a shared cookie, a worn gray scarf now tucked safely in Amelia's backpack. It was a story of simple decency, but in Isabella's world, nothing was ever that simple. She ended the call, her mind no longer on profit margins or market shares. The image of her daughter, alone and crying on a cold street corner, was a physical blow. She had built an empire to give Amelia everything, yet she couldn't even ensure she had someone to meet her at the bus stop. The guilt was suffocating. She had to find this man. Not just to thank him, but to see him for herself, to understand the person who had shown her daughter a kindness she herself had been too busy to provide. Driven by an uncharacteristic impulse she couldn't quite name, gratitude mixed with a healthy dose of suspicion, Isabella bypassed her private elevator and headed for the main lobby. Maria was meeting her there with Amelia, who had an afternoon appointment with the orthodontist. As she swept through the gleaming marble expanse, her eyes scanned the faces of the people rushing by. She had a vague description, a quiet man with a daughter. It was laughably insufficient. The lobby cafe, a place she usually sent her assistant to, was bustling. She stepped up to the counter, her mind elsewhere, ready to place her usual order for black coffee, strong and uncomplicated. "What can I get for you?" The voice was low and steady. She looked up, and for a second, the world tilted. It was him. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. He looked tired, the skin under his eyes shadowed with fatigue, but there was a stillness about him, a quiet dignity that seemed out of place amidst the frantic energy of the lobby. Before she could speak, a small voice piped up from beside her. "Mommy, look." Amelia, having just arrived with Maria, was pointing a small finger. "It's him. The man from the bus stop. That's the daddy and he has a little girl just like me." Finn froze, the portafilter halfway to the machine. He looked from the impossibly elegant woman in front of him to the little girl with the familiar pink coat. The girl from the bus stop. His face flushed, a wave of anxiety washing over him. Had he done something wrong? Was she here to complain? He felt the weight of a dozen critical eyes on him. Isabella's gaze sharpened, taking in his worn uniform, the faint coffee stain on his sleeve. This was him. Just a man serving coffee. "You," she said, her voice more abrupt than she intended. "My daughter. Amelia, she told me what you did this morning." Finn swallowed, placing the portafilter down with a soft click. "She was upset," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I just wanted to make sure she was okay." Isabella reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her wallet, and slid $100 bill across the counter. Thank you for your kindness. It felt transactional, cold, the only way she knew how to operate. Finn looked at the bill, then back at her. A flicker of something, pride, maybe hurt, crossed his face. That's not necessary, he said, gently pushing it back toward her. I'm glad she's all right. No charge for the coffee. He turned to serve the next customer, leaving Isabella standing there, the crisp bill a barrier between their two worlds, feeling strangely and completely dismissed. It became a new, unspoken routine. Each morning, Isabella found an excuse to go down to the lobby cafe herself. She told herself it was about efficiency, about wanting to stretch her legs, but she knew it was a lie. She was drawn to the quiet barista who had refused her money. She started observing him. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and work-worn, were gentle as he handed a hot chocolate to a child. She saw the patient smile he gave an elderly man who took 5 minutes to count out his change. He treated everyone with the same steady, unassuming respect, whether they were a janitor or a vice president. He was a constant in the chaotic swirl of her corporate world. One afternoon, she saw a little girl with a navy coat and bright pigtails run up to the counter. "Daddy, I got a star on my spelling test." The girl, Rosie, beamed, holding up a paper. Finn's entire demeanor changed. The fatigue lifted from his eyes, replaced by a light so pure and proud it momentarily stunned Isabella. He crouched down, ignoring the line of impatient customers, and examined the paper as if it were the most important document in the world. "That's my brilliant girl," he murmured, his voice thick with love. Isabella felt a pang in her chest, a hollow ache of something she was missing. She had video calls with Amelia scheduled between meetings, but this raw, present connection was a foreign language to her. She started to linger, ordering a second coffee she didn't need, just to exchange a few words with him. She learned his name was Finn. He learned hers, though he already knew it from the nameplate on her office tower. She discovered he was a widower, that Rosie was his whole world. He learned, through carefully worded phrases, that her ex-husband was more interested in his new life in another country than in his own daughter. They were both single parents, navigating a lonely, demanding path, albeit from opposite ends of the social spectrum. The sterile lobby cafe began to feel like a small island of warmth in her cold, structured life. But she wasn't the only one who noticed. Garrett, the manager, watched the CEO's daily visits with a toxic mix of jealousy and suspicion, his thin lips curling into a sneer every time Isabella smiled at his subordinate. Garrett's resentment festered. He saw Finn not as a person, but as an obstacle, a nobody who had somehow captured the attention of the most powerful woman in the building. He couldn't comprehend that it was Finn's character, not some hidden agenda, that drew her in. In Garrett's world, everyone had an angle. He decided it was time to remove the anomaly. The opportunity came on a busy Tuesday. The cafe was understaffed, the morning rush was relentless, and Finn was working a double shift, his movements strained with exhaustion. Garrett waited until the peak of the chaos, then made his move. He deliberately shortchanged a customer he knew was notoriously difficult, pocketing the difference himself when no one was looking. An hour later, as the rush subsided, he called Finn over to the register. "We have a problem," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false concern. He gestured to the till. "The drawer is short. $50 short. And I just had a customer call to complain that he was given the wrong change." "By you," Finn's blood ran cold. "What? That's impossible." "I'm always careful," he knew he was. He had to be. Every dollar was accounted for, both at work and at home. "Is that so?" Garrett's voice rose, attracting the attention of the remaining customers and staff. "Because it seems to me that a single dad, struggling to make ends meet, might find himself in a desperate situation. It's a classic story." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Humiliation washed over Finn in a hot wave. He saw the whispers, the sideways glances from his co-workers. His integrity was all he had left, the one thing he was determined to model for Rosie. And here, in this place he hated but desperately needed, it was being stripped away from him in public. "I didn't take anything," Finn said, his voice low but firm, his gaze unwavering. "You can check the cameras," Garrett smirked, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eye. "Oh, I will. But by the time I get around to it, you'll be long gone. I'm calling security." "You're fired, Finn." "For theft," he spat the word out, savoring the impact. Finn felt the floor drop out from under him. Fired. For theft. How would he pay the rent? How would he explain this to Rosie, who was due to meet him in less than an hour, her spelling test still proudly taped to their refrigerator at home? He felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. Just as Garrett reached for the phone to call security, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. What, exactly, is going on here? Isabella Vance stood at the entrance of the cafe, her briefcase in hand, her expression unreadable. Every head turned. Garrett's sneer was instantly replaced by a sycophantic smile. Ms. Vance. Just a small internal matter. This employee, he said, gesturing dismissively at Finn, has been caught stealing from the register. I was just handling it. Isabella's gaze moved from Garrett's smug face to Finn's. He was pale, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, but his eyes met hers directly. There was no deceit in them, only a deep, desperate hurt and a fierce, quiet dignity. She saw Rosie standing hesitantly near the lobby entrance, her small face clouded with confusion and fear, clutching her backpack. This was the man who had wrapped his own scarf around her daughter's neck. This was the father who treasured a spelling test like a stock certificate. The pieces didn't fit. He's a thief, Ms. Vance, Garrett pressed on, sensing a moment of hesitation. You can't trust people like him. They see an opportunity, a person like you paying attention to them, and they take advantage. It was a moral crossroads for Isabella. Every business instinct she had honed told her to trust the system, to believe her manager, to cut the liability. Her world was built on verifiable data and calculated risks. But her heart, a part of her she had long suppressed in the boardroom, was telling her something different. It was remembering a little girl's tear-streaked face, and another little girl's offering of a cookie. It was weighing the manufactured certainty in Garrett's voice against the quiet, unwavering integrity she had witnessed in Finn day after day. She had to choose. She looked at Finn, who hadn't said another word in his own defense, his primary concern clearly the small, watching eyes of his daughter. His silence was more powerful than any denial. Is that so, Garrett? Isabella said, her voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. You're certain he's a thief? Garrett puffed out his chest. Absolutely. The drawer is short, then you won't mind if we review the security footage, she stated, not a question but a command. Right now. My office has a direct feed. The color drained from Garrett's face. The air in Isabella's vast, minimalist office was thick with a new kind of tension. On the large screen that usually displayed market analytics, a grainy, black and white video from the cafe was playing. Isabella, Finn, and the head of building security stood watching in silence. Garrett shifted from foot to foot, a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. The footage was damningly clear. It showed Finn working diligently, his interactions with customers precise and honest. Then, it showed Garrett approaching the register during a moment of distraction, his back to the camera, his hand dipping quickly into the cash drawer before he served the difficult customer. The lie was exposed in stark, irrefutable detail. Garrett began to stammer, a pathetic string of excuses and denials, but Isabella held up a hand, silencing him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet disappointment was more withering than any tirade. Pack your things, she said to him, her voice like ice. Security will escort you out. Your career with this company is over. Garrett stared at her, his bravado completely shattered, and then scurried from the room. Isabella turned off the monitor, plunging the office back into a quiet stillness. She turned to Finn, whose face was a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I am so sorry, she said, and the words were not the perfunctory apology of a CEO, but the sincere regret of a human being. I am so deeply sorry you were put through that. Finn simply nodded, the knot of fear in his chest finally beginning to loosen. Thank you, he managed to say. For believing me. I didn't believe you, Isabella corrected him gently, her gaze softening. I trusted my daughter. She told me you were a kind man. It seems she's a better judge of character than I am. A rare, small smile touched her lips. She walked over to her desk, not to dismiss him, but to pull out a set of blueprints. Finn, I've been working on a project. A new employee wellness center for this building. It's meant to have better food options, a proper lounge, even a small, subsidized childcare facility. A place that values people over profit. She spread the plans on the table. I've been looking for someone to manage it. Someone with integrity, who understands what it means to care for people, who knows that small kindnesses are not small at all. I was looking for someone like you. Finn stared at the blueprints, then at her, his mind struggling to process the whiplash of the last hour. From being fired for theft to this. It didn't seem real. Me. But I just make coffee. No, Isabella said, her voice firm. You see people. You connect with them. That's a rarer skill than you can imagine. The job is yours, if you want it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Finn walked away from the sticky counters and humming fluorescent lights of the lobby cafe for the last time, not as a disgraced employee, but as a new manager. The offer had been terrifying. It was a world of budgets, planning meetings, and responsibilities he felt utterly unprepared for. But every time doubt crept in, Isabella was there, steady and encouraging. She didn't treat him like a project or a charity case, she treated him like a partner. Their meetings were no longer across a coffee counter but a blueprint table, their conversations shifting from pleasantries to shared visions. He spoke of creating a space that felt warm and welcoming, a refuge from the corporate pressure. He suggested a reading corner for kids, healthy and affordable meal options, and a pay-it-forward coffee system. Isabella listened, not with the detached air of a CEO, but with genuine interest, incorporating his ideas into the final design. The dynamic between them slowly, carefully, began to transform. The professional respect blossomed into a tentative friendship, built on the shared ground of late-night planning sessions and a mutual devotion to their children. Rosie and Amelia, meanwhile, had formed an immediate and inseparable bond. They had playdates that started in Isabella's sprawling, sterile apartment and ended in Finn and Rosie's cozy, cluttered one, filling both spaces with a level of laughter and joyful chaos they had been missing. One evening, as they watched the girls build a lopsided pillow fort in Finn's living room, Isabella looked around at the crayon drawings on the fridge, the well-loved storybooks piled on the coffee table, the lingering smell of baked cookies. "You've built a real home here, Finn," she said, her voice soft. Finn looked at the empty armchair in the corner, the one that had belonged to his wife. For years, it had been a monument to his grief. But tonight, with the sound of their daughters giggling and Isabella sitting on his worn sofa, it looked less like a void and more like a space waiting to be filled. "We're trying," he said, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips. The life-changing opportunity wasn't just the job, it was the slow, careful rebuilding of a family, one pillow fort and shared smile at a time. The promotion was a new beginning, but the real prize was the unexpected connection that was healing them both. 6 months later, the Vance Industries Wellness Center was officially open. The space was bright and airy, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the gentle hum of happy conversation. Natural light streamed through large windows, illuminating a vibrant mural the children from the new daycare facility had helped paint. At the center of it all was Finn. He wasn't wearing a stained apron anymore, but a simple, clean shirt, his posture straighter, the chronic exhaustion in his eyes replaced with a quiet confidence. He moved through the space with a sense of ownership and pride, greeting employees by name, checking in on the kitchen staff, and stopping to admire a little boy's block tower in the childcare area. He was no longer invisible. He was the heart of this new community. Isabella stood by the coffee bar, watching him. She had come down not as the CEO for a formal inspection, but just to be there. He saw her and his face broke into a warm, genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. He poured her a coffee, just the way she liked it, without her having to ask. "It's incredible, Finn," she said, her voice filled with sincere admiration. "You've made it better than I ever imagined." "We made it," he corrected her, his hand briefly covering hers on the counter. The simple touch sent a jolt of warmth through her, a current of connection that was now as familiar as it was thrilling. Their gazes met and held, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken from that awkward, transactional meeting to this moment of shared creation. From the corner of her eye, Isabella saw Rosie and Amelia sitting in the reading nook, their heads bent together over a book, their friendship as easy and natural as breathing. The pristine pink coat and the hand-me-down navy one were long gone, replaced by clothes that were comfortable and played in. They were just two little girls, secure and loved. The memory of that cold morning at the bus stop felt like a lifetime ago, a single, pivotal domino that had set this entire, beautiful chain of events in motion. A lost mitten, a shared cookie, a borrowed scarf. It was a reminder that the most profound changes in life often begin not with grand strategies or corporate takeovers, but with the smallest, most unassuming acts of human kindness. The empty chair in Finn's apartment was no longer empty. Isabella and Amelia had filled it, their presence weaving a new, stronger fabric of family around the three of them, and soon, it would be the four of them. A quiet dad, a powerful CEO, and two little girls had found their way home, all because one person chose to see another's tears and offer a little warmth against the cold. The cold shock of the water was a familiar enemy. Ethan Hayes moved through it with a grim efficiency, his arms cutting through the dark surface of Blackwood Lake, his focus narrowed to a single point, the thrashing shape a dozen yards ahead. He'd heard the scream from the shore, a sharp, terrified sound that had sliced through the quiet afternoon he was sharing with his daughter. One moment, he was watching 7-year-old Rosie sketch the ancient pines in her notebook, the next, he was kicking off his worn boots and hitting the water. He didn't think. He just moved. The upturned canoe bobbed uselessly nearby, a sleek, expensive thing that had no business being out in the sudden chop. He reached the woman just as her strength gave out, her head slipping beneath the waves. He grabbed a fistful of her soaked blazer, hauling her back to the surface. She sputtered, coughing up water, her eyes wide with a terror that was quickly fading into unconsciousness. He hooked an arm under her chin, keeping her airway clear, and began the slow, burning swim back to shore. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but even in the panicked haze, he felt a strange, unsettling flicker of recognition. It was a ghost of a memory, too distant to grasp. He dismissed it. Right now, she was just a life he had to save. Back on the rocky bank, he laid her down, immediately starting chest compressions, his movements sure and steady from a first aid course he'd taken years ago. Rosie stood back, her small face a mask of worry, clutching her drawing pad to her chest. "Is she okay, Daddy?" "She will be," Ethan promised, not for the woman, but for his daughter. He didn't look at the woman's face again until the paramedics arrived, their sirens wailing as they navigated the winding lakeside road. Only then, as they loaded her onto a stretcher, did he allow himself a proper look. Her features were sharp and elegant, framed by dark, wet hair plastered to her skin. She looked powerful, even helpless like this. A stranger. He was sure of it. He pulled his soaked shirt tighter around himself, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sudden, sharp memory of another body of water, another loss he could not prevent. He pushed it down, turning to wrap a strong arm around his daughter. The immediate danger was over. The echoes, however, were just beginning. Back in the warmth of their small, two-room cabin, the scent of pine and drying laundry filled the air. Ethan wrapped Rosie in her favorite fuzzy blanket, a faded yellow one covered in smiling cartoon suns. He made her hot chocolate, his hands still trembling slightly as he stirred the milk. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. His job as a groundskeeper for the Blackwood Lake Resort paid just enough to keep their small world turning, but it demanded a physical toll. Today had added an emotional one. He watched Rosie carefully draw a picture of a man pulling a woman from a lake, her crayon hero a stick figure with a determined frown just like his. He managed a weak smile. He was her hero, and that was the only title that ever mattered. The woman from the lake, he'd learned from the frantic resort manager, was Amelia Vance, the CEO of Vance Innovations. She was the architect of a potential hostile takeover of the entire resort, a corporate titan whose presence had been a source of anxious gossip among the staff for weeks. And he, the man who mowed the lawns and fixed the leaky faucets, had just pulled her from a watery grave. The irony was a bitter pill. He tucked Rosie into her small bed, kissing her forehead. "You were very brave today, sweet pea," he whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and serious. "You were braver, Daddy." "You're always the bravest." He sat by her side until her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of his own past, Ethan felt the weight of it all. He was just a single father, trying to build a safe harbor for his daughter, a man defined by a loss he could never outrun. His wife, Sarah, had loved the water. The crash that took her had happened on a rain-slicked road beside a river. For years, he'd avoided so much as looking at a lake. Coming here had been a test, a way to prove he wouldn't let fear own him or his daughter. Today, the water had tested him again, and he had won. But as he looked out the window at the moonlit lake, he wondered what it had truly cost him. Amelia Vance awoke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Her first sensation was a raw, aching in her chest. Her second was the sight of Richard, her fiancé, pacing at the foot of her hospital bed, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't looking at her, he was dictating a press release. "Ms. Vance is in stable condition," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "She expresses her profound gratitude to the resort staff for their swift action. We anticipate a full recovery and a continuation of our business discussions in the coming days." He finally noticed her eyes were open and ended the call with a curt dismissal. "Amelia, thank God," he said, his relief sounding more like annoyance at a disrupted schedule. "You had us all worried." "The board is in a panic," she tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. She remembered the canoe tipping, the shocking cold, the feeling of her lungs screaming for air. Then, a strong arm, a sense of being pulled upward. "The man," she rasped. "Who saved me?" "Some groundskeeper," Richard said dismissively, waving a hand. "We'll send him a check. A generous one. It's a good PR angle, actually. Corporate chief saved by the common man. We can spin this." Amelia closed her eyes. The hollowness she so often felt in her life, the one she filled with 16-hour workdays and ruthless acquisitions, felt like a cavern inside her now. Richard saw a PR angle. She had almost died. A few days later, against Richard's strenuous objections, she insisted on thanking the men in person. Ethan Hayes stood on the porch of his rustic cabin, his posture straight, his hands clean but his nails permanently rimmed with the earth he worked. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear and direct. "Ma'am," he said with a simple nod. "I'm glad to see you're all right. I wanted to thank you," Amelia said, feeling strangely formal. "You saved my life. I'd like to offer you a reward." Ethan shook his head before she could even name a figure. "No, thank you. I just did what anyone would have." He looked past her, his gaze softening as Rosie peeked out from behind the door. "My daughter was there. I'd want someone to do the same for me if she were in trouble." His quiet dignity was a wall she couldn't breach with money. It was unnerving. It was compelling. She saw the worn soles of his boots, the faint patch on the elbow of his jacket, and understood that he needed the money. His refusal wasn't pride, it was principle. And in her world, principle was a commodity rarer than gold. Richard was furious. He saw Ethan's refusal not as a mark of character, but as an insult, a strategic play he couldn't comprehend. Everyone has a price, he seethed in the privacy of their luxury suite. This man is either a fool or he's trying to manipulate you for something bigger. A lawsuit, maybe. Amelia ignored him. She found herself drawn to the quieter parts of the resort, near the staff cabins. From a distance, she watched Ethan and Rosie. She saw him patiently teaching his daughter how to skip stones across the lake's calm surface. She saw them tending a small vegetable garden behind their cabin, their heads bent close together in shared concentration. There was a simple, unvarnished love between them that felt more real than anything in her own life. Her engagement to Richard was a strategic alliance, a merger of two powerful families to consolidate their hold on the market. It was a business decision, not a matter of the heart. Her heart was a locked room she hadn't visited in years. As she watched Ethan, fragments of another time began to surface, hazy and indistinct. The scent of pine needles baking in the sun. The feel of a worn denim jacket. The sound of a pencil scratching against paper. She remembered a summer spent here at this very lake, long before the resort was built, when her family had rented a small cottage. She had been a teenager, all awkward limbs and big dreams. And there had been a boy. A local boy with quiet eyes and a gentle smile, who knew the name of every tree and every constellation in the night sky. She couldn't recall his face clearly, but she remembered the feeling of safety, of being seen for who she was, not who she was supposed to become. Richard's voice, sharp and demanding, would inevitably pull her back to the present. He wanted to finalize the takeover, to crush the small, family-owned resort under the heel of their corporate giant. But Amelia found herself hesitating. The place held a whisper of a memory, a ghost of a girl she used to be. And the groundskeeper, the quiet man with the kind eyes, felt like a part of that forgotten world. The moment of clarity came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Amelia had walked down to the shoreline, needing to escape the suffocating pressure of another conference call with her board. She passed Ethan's cabin and saw the door was slightly ajar. Pinned to the old wooden frame by a magnet was a child's drawing. It was a picture of a tall, slender lighthouse standing on a rocky cliff, waves crashing at its base. The crayon strokes were clumsy but heartfelt. But it wasn't the drawing itself that made Amelia stop, her breath catching in her throat. It was the subject. The Blackwood Point Lighthouse, which had been decommissioned and torn down 15 years ago. A tourist would never know it had existed. Only a local, someone with deep roots, would remember it. The image slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. A memory, sharp and vivid this time, a teenage boy sitting beside her on a sun-warmed dock, a worn sketchbook open on his lap. He was drawing that exact lighthouse, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had given her the drawing as a keepsake on the last day of that summer. A promise to remember. She'd kept it for years, until it was lost in one of her family's many moves. Eth, she whispered, the nickname tasting foreign on her tongue after 2 decades. His name was Eth. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw Ethan coming around the side of the cabin, carrying a small basket of late-season tomatoes. He stopped when he saw her staring at the drawing, a question in his eyes. She took a hesitant step forward. "The lighthouse," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I remember someone who used to draw that lighthouse." His gaze sharpened, a flicker of disbelief warring with a dawning recognition. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the expensive clothes and the air of command. He saw the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the things that time hadn't changed. "Amy," he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. Amy Preston. Amelia Vance, the titan of industry, felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart crumble to dust. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's me, Eth," she said softly. "It's me." The 20 years that had separated them dissolved in an instant, leaving only the boy and girl who had shared a single, perfect summer by the lake. They sat on the small porch of his cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was filled with the weight of unspoken years. Rosie sat on the steps, humming quietly to herself as she organized a collection of smooth, gray stones, occasionally glancing at the 2 adults with a child's placid curiosity. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Your family just left. One day your cottage was empty. No note, no goodbye." Amelia looked down at her hands, the hands that signed multi-million-dollar deals, now twisting in her lap like a nervous teenager's. "My father got a promotion. A big one. We moved to London. It was all so fast. He said there wasn't time for goodbyes. He said teenage summer romances were foolish distractions." The bitterness in her voice was ancient. "I wrote to you," she added quietly. 4 months. But the letters all came back." Ethan nodded slowly. "My family moved after my dad lost his job at the mill. We were only a few towns over, but I guess the letters never found me." They filled in the broad strokes